Hello, friends. Pastor Tanner, and this is week 2 of our focus on baptism. Last week I called it Baptism 101, and so we can call this Baptism 102, I guess. I don't know. But as we approach Easter with the invitation for people to be baptized, I want to take a few moments each week to just kind of explore the significance and the meaning of baptism beyond what we kind of reduce it to by default if we're not paying a lot of attention to it. Kind of the default setting is that we say baptism is a public announcement that I believe certain things about Jesus. I believe Jesus was God's son. I believe he died. I believe he rose again. I believe that somehow works to remove sin from my life, right? I believe these things, and it's my baptism that I'm announcing publicly that I believe these things. And that's all true, and I'm not trying to negate any of that. But I do believe that we need to dig into the rich history and belief surrounding baptism that we may miss if we just reduce it to that simple concept of announcing that we believe certain doctrinal truth. Last week we looked at a belief that moving through the baptism waters is moving through waters from one kingdom to another. So we're partnering with the Hebrews as they go on exodus out of the kingdom of Egypt and move through the Red Sea, or we're partnering with the people of God and the priests as they cross through the Jordan River into the promised land. But it's exiting one kingdom and entering into another kingdom, and baptism represents that. And so there's a lot of that going on in the Bible, is this imagery of moving through water. This week we're going to look at baptism as pledging our allegiance to King Jesus. My note's locked. And so to do this, and to understand the depth of meaning here behind baptism as a commitment or a pledging of allegiance, we need to understand that there's some words that we think of in our modern day context as spiritual or churchy words that in their original usage, or in the time of Jesus and in the time of the New Testament, weren't specifically religious, churchy, spiritual language. So for example, the word church, the word that's in the Bible for church Jesus didn't invent it. It wasn't a word that meant anything religious or spiritual. It meant people that were called out, and they were called out to do some sort of civic function, civic duty. They were like on a committee or a team that was supposed to do something in their society, tackle an issue or task, or something like that in their culture, in their society. They were given a task, and this is what the ecclesia, the church, was originally a non-religious thing. Obviously, Jesus gave that new meaning, and kind of goes from there. So that's just a good example of how it wasn't originally a spiritual word, and Jesus gives it new meaning, right? Another word that shows up like that is the word gospel, right? So we hear the word gospel, and we associate that with Jesus, the Bible, the plan of salvation, even. For some religious traditions, you hear the word gospel and you go to a few verses, and for example, the book of Romans, you take some of Paul's letters and you piece together a formula or a step-by-step thing, and that's what we hear the gospel as. But we have in our Bible 4 gospels, and to say that those are gospels, we need to understand what a gospel is, and it makes more sense. So a gospel, and we say this in the church, we say this often, that gospel is good news, right? So that's correct, right? I'm not trying to say that the gospel doesn't have to do anything with salvation, or don't hear me there, but we want to understand the original context, and then as we see how Jesus used that original context, we can make sense of some other things. But it meant good news. Think back, though, in an ancient world where empires and kingdoms would be conquered by other great kingdoms. Powerful emperors would come and conquer a land, a new territory. And the people that lived in that conquered territory, newly conquered territory, had to find out somehow that they're now conquered people. They now have a new king. They now have a new ruler. And so we're going to use just the Roman Empire just as a real easy example, because most of us are familiar with the Roman Empire. There's an emperor who ruled, right? And so let's say the Roman Empire conquered a new territory, and the emperor would send heralds, which is another non-spiritual word that the church has used for its own purposes, and so we've started to make it a spiritual word, but heralds or messengers, which gets translated in our Bibles to the word angel. So the emperor would send angels out, messengers out, heralds out with the announcement that you are now conquered by a new king. But it wasn't just this random announcement. It wasn't like sending an email saying, FYI, you haven't, but you needed to know the backstory. You needed to know who this king was, where he came from, what made him significant, why he was special, right? Why this king is better than your last king, why your last king was horrible, and why this new king was ordained to rule, whether it be by divine ordination, God dictated this, or there's just something uniquely special around the circumstances of the king's birth. There's something special about the way that the king grew up. He had special abilities, powers, whatever it might be. So the story goes out and it declares to these people, you have a new king. Let us tell you about who this new king is. And then you get their story. And then it would usually involve some sort of summary of the battle. And it's propaganda, right? Like, it's not historical. Like, they weren't trying to be accurate. They were trying to portray the new king as this amazing hero. And, he might not even have been at the battle, but the gospel, the good news, is going to have him out in front leading the charge or something. And then, so you've got this gospel, this good news is announced. You have a new king. Your land is now part of a new kingdom, right? And that the way that story is told leaves the hearer with a choice, right? You can either accept that new king. You can hear the gospel and say, yes, I believe that is true. And now I'm going to live under the teachings of that new king. I'm going to live in a kingdom that is shaped by the dictates, the teachings, and the laws of that new king. Or I'm not, right? I'm going to refuse the new king. I'm going to continue to live according to the ways of the old king. And that would be viewed as in rebellion against the new king, right? What you couldn't do was remain neutral. There was no way, there was no land in between here, right? What would that even look like? You've been conquered by a new king, and you hear this message, and it'd be like, you either got to continue living under the old kingdom ways or embrace the new kingdom ways. There wasn't a third option, I'll wait and see, or this doesn't impact my life at all. Either you're going to follow the teachings of the new king or you're not. And so that was the context of this. And so when we have the Gospels of Jesus that teach his birth story, where he came from, his background, point to his divine significance, God is with him, that he's special, he's healing people. It has a whole section on his teachings, his significant teachings. And so angels, heralds, people that would proclaim this gospel would preach this to the public, and they would share the good news. And the response, the invitation was still the same. Do you refuse this gospel and continue to live under the ways of a king who's been defeated? Do you reject this new king and his new kingdom? Or do you accept this new king and his kingdom and pledge your allegiance and submit to his authority, learn the ways of life in this new kingdom, and become a follower and a servant of this new king? Or do you not? That's what we're confronted with. A proper presentation of the gospel is one that demands a response. and it's built into the proclamation. Like, you can't, like I said, you can't just take a we'll wait and see type of attitude. It declares, and again, the point is not to ask somebody, do they believe that this happened, right? The preaching of the gospel was never intended to be about belief. Now, this is challenging for us in our sense, because we're 2,000 years removed from Jesus walking the earth. We never saw him teach or heal. We never saw him crucified. We never saw him resurrected, right? And so, and these are pretty fantastical claims. And so the challenge for us may seem to be, do I believe that any of this even happened? You know, the Bible says it. Do I believe the Bible? And saying yes is a pretty big first step, right? Like, I believe this happened. But that's not the purpose of the gospel. It's not to get us to say, here's an idea. Do I agree with it? The purpose of the gospel is to invite us to pledge our allegiance to this new king, to hear the ways that the king is teaching his people to live, i.e. the Sermon on the Mount and the parables and some of the other teachings, and to become people who are shaped by the way that this new king wants to order his kingdom, right? And so it's more than just, I agree that this happened, but it's I am now obediently faithful to this king. And that's the word I want to bring in there, faithful, right? So we use the word faith, and sometimes that indicates belief, right? Like, I said, like, my faith is in Jesus, right? I believe in Jesus. But faith involves a certain level of trust, right? Certain level of action behind it. James says faith without works is dead. Faith that doesn't move, faith that doesn't require us to act in a particular way, is just agreeing with an idea. And so faith involves a certain level of trust. But in our look at baptism today, we're going to go even beyond just trust and saying that, I'm going to do what Jesus tells me to do. But it's this pledging of allegiance that happens in baptism. It's this full submission to this new kingdom. It's when we do a wedding ceremony, we invite people to make a covenant to forsake all others. And in a baptism ceremony, we have the similar language. It's, do we denounce and abandon anything that the devil may have for us, embracing only Jesus as our king? Are we willing to let go of all of our attachments to the old kingdom, and the old kingdoms and old kings, including the way that they taught us how to live, including the way that they have shaped us and the values of those kingdoms? Do we let go of all of that and embrace Jesus as our king, and therefore embrace the way that he teaches us to live as the way that I am going to live? And so baptism is about a commitment to submission and submitting to the authority of our new king. And so there's a lot going on here. And like I said, this was the significant step. The world seemed to get this really well throughout human history. They didn't care about people going to heaven when they died. Like, that wasn't the thing that upset them about Christianity. They were curious about communion. That was kind of a weird thing to them. But persecutions didn't happen because people sat around the table and shared a meal together. Persecutions happened when people would, in baptism, declare that there was no king but King Jesus, and that they were abandoning their affiliations and their allegiances to the kings and the ways of this world. That made people nervous. It made people that had an allegiance to pagan gods were worried that Christians were going to bring about judgment from these pagan gods. It made it really easy to scapegoat them anytime things went wrong, is because, look, they've abandoned the faith of these other gods. And so we find that baptism throughout the history of the church has been the significant moment in the life of a believer, not because they've finally said, I believe, but because they are committing to rejecting the ways of the world. They've declared their allegiance to nobody but this King Jesus. Now, the good thing for the world is that our new king, King Jesus, doesn't go scorched earth on the old kingdom. He doesn't tell us to destroy our neighbors. He tells us to love our neighbors. And so while the world gets nervous when we start saying, I have no king but King Jesus, our king is a loving king, and he tells us to love the world, to love our neighbors. Pastor Will used the image in the sermon last week about Adam and Eve being given dominion in the garden and told to tend to it, right? And so that's the type of command that we get from our King Jesus, is to tend to the garden, tend to the life, seek the flourishing, seek the peace and prosperity in the city in which we live in, right? Like Jesus is telling us that as his servants, as his followers, we are responsible for the communities in which we live. And so while our neighbors might get nervous and they may not understand our allegiances, it's not us against them. It's us for them. We extend God's benevolent kingdom, his loving kingdom of mercy and grace into the world wherever we go. And so that's baptism, allegiance to King Jesus. And if you got questions about this, if this sounds awkward or foreign or really challenges things, and again, I'm not saying like this isn't about going to heaven. I'm not saying this, we're ignoring salvation, but I'm just talking about in the context in which the world Jesus lived, gospel meant something significant. And baptism was a response to the gospel. It was citizenship being declared. It was citizenship being renounced of previous kingdoms as you embrace the new kingdom. And so that's challenging for us. It's about identity. It's about our sense of family, who we are a part of once we are baptized. And so, yes, let's celebrate that somebody believes that the Bible is true. But more importantly, as believers in Jesus, let us celebrate one who has committed their life to serve King Jesus. And as the body of Christ, let us walk with them and encourage them, disciple them, teach them along the way. Because it is in the Bible that Jesus teaches us as the church that is our job to baptize in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. So baptism is something that the church has to do in order to be faithful to that command. And so baptism, yes, it's a celebration of an individual doing something, but it's also a celebration of the church being faithful to which God has called it to be. So if you got questions, you want to talk baptism, you want to talk about gospel allegiance, I've got some resources, or I'd love to just chat with you, but feel free to reach out. And if you're interested in being baptized on Easter Sunday morning, let me know ASAP, because I got to make some plans if that's going to be the case, and we need to have a conversation first. So hope this is helpful, maybe a little bit challenging. Hopefully it didn't make you too uncomfortable, but I like to challenge the norms a little bit and make it a little bit uncomfortable because God can work in our uncomfort. So anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you soon.